What's good, YouTube? It's your boy Infamous Ghost Money, back at you with another financial fraud video, this time involving a wife and husband out of Maryfield, Virginia, who were recently sentenced for running a savage identity theft scheme in which they defrauded numerous victims and racked up over $600,000 in losses in less than 2 years. We're gonna dissect the paperwork to find out how they did their thing, how law enforcement was able to shut down their operation, and when it was all said and done, reflect on some ways we could protect our identities from these type of fraud schemes. So make sure you hit that like button and also subscribe to the channel to add some quality, informative, and entertaining content to your YouTube timeline and stay one step ahead of these fraudsters. Alright, let's get right into the information. Friday, October 14th, 2022, a Maryfield, Virginia real estate agent, Caprice Foster, and her husband, Marcus Foster, was sentenced for fraud using stolen personal information. According to the case documents, on January 8th, 2017, Marcus Foster set up the business entity, the Foster Investment Group LLC, as a real estate consulting company, but in reality, the company was actually used as a front throughout various aspects of the scheme, as we will soon find out. Next, Caprice Foster was employed with the Hilton Grand Vacations from August 2017 to August 2019, and she also worked as a real estate agent from 2015 to 2017. During Caprice's employment, the Fosters would steal the personal information of the clients Caprice worked with, and they would also illegally obtain personal information by stealing it from the mail. Once they had their hands on info, they would use it to set up phony email addresses and virtual phone numbers in these victims' names, and create fake ID documents such as driver's licenses, social security cards, and passports. And also, remember y'all, the Fosters had a special advantage when it came to the way that they stole information, because Caprice would have actual copies of many of her clients' information when she would sign them up for timeshares or do other real estate transactions. So when they would make or get these fake IDs created, I'd imagine the information was 100% on point. Anyway, they would then use all the information they stole to open fraud bank accounts as well as apply for credit cards, loans, and lines of credit in these people's names unknowingly. Once they got the accounts open, they used all sorts of methods to cash out on them, including transferring cash from the fraudulently opened lines of credit and loans that they applied for, depositing stolen and washed checks, and depositing credit card convenience checks that they either requested from the credit cards that they opened or obtained from the mail that they stole. The Fosters would also use Caprice's inside info that she had as a real estate agent to know which properties in the area were vacant, and they would use these addresses to receive debit cards, credit cards, and checkbooks from the accounts that they opened. And as for Foster Investments, they would use the phony real estate company as the employer on many of the fake credit products they applied for, which would allow them to easily cook up fake employment and proof of income documents, as well as trick banks when they would call the company to verify the employment of the victims they defrauded. And it doesn't stop there, y'all. They would also use the stolen identities to obtain apartment leases in these people's names. Once again, using cooked up documents that they got from Caprice's employment, and of course, in typical scammer fashion, they wouldn't pay the rent, racking up thousands of dollars in past due rent on these victims' credit until they would either get evicted or move on to the next spot and do it all over again. Over the span of less than 2 years, the paperwork associated with the case calls out several victims who the Fosters shamelessly stole the identity of and ran up over $600,000 in various losses in their names. One of the first victims called out in the paperwork is identified as GM, who while vacationing on June 2018 in Washington, D.C., unfortunately met Caprice while attending a timeshare presentation. Caprice would approach GM at the presentation and try to talk her into upgrading her timeshare, and during the conversation, Caprice and GM would build rapport as Caprice would inform GM that she was a member of the same sorority as her, and GM would even take a picture with Caprice since she resembled her nephew's wife so much. At the end of the meeting, GM wouldn't sign up for the upgrade, but she would complete an application for a Hilton American Express card with Caprice, which of course included a bunch of her personal identifying information. About 2 months later, on August 25th, 2018, the Fosters would use GM's identity to start a new apartment lease with a luxury property management company in McLean, Virginia, known as the Kingston. who, according to my research, has monthly rents ranging from $1,800 to $5,000 a month. The Fosters would submit the lease application online using a newly created email address in GM's name and fraudulently list Marcus's phony company as GM's employer. They would also list the residents and occupants of the property as GM, MW, and a third individual who was later identified to be Caprice's actual daughter. So just in case you didn't catch that, they applied for a lease in someone else's name, but proceeded to put her actual daughter's real identity as one of the occupants. Sloppy work, y'all, just sloppy work. Anyway, the Fosters would stay in the property without paying rent until they would eventually be evicted on April 16, 2019, after racking up nearly $20,000 in unpaid rent and utility charges. About a month later, the Fosters would pull a similar play, this time using the information of another set of clients, WG and LC, that Caprice assisted in purchasing a home back in 2015. According to the case paperwork, from between May to August 2019, the Fosters would use the information of these past clients to open bank accounts with JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo Bank, as well as start another lease for a property located in Preserve Crest Way in McLean, Virginia. The Fosters would once again not pay rent and be evicted, but this time on August 22, 2019, Marcus Foster would appear at the eviction proceeding, posing as WG in court. The audacity. Another victim called out in the paperwork is RD, who traveled to Washington, D.C. on April 2019 with her husband to stay at the Hilton timeshare since they were interested in purchasing it. The pair was lucky enough to have Caprice assigned as their point of contact for the timeshare application, and as I'm sure you could guess, she would get right to work on stealing the identity of these poor folks. A couple months after Caprice met with RD and her husband, the Fosters would use RD's information to open a bank account with SunTrust Bank on August 20th, 2019, and the next day, Marcus would deposit a stolen Citibank credit card convenience check for $4,580 into the account, and of course, he would later be identified on bank video surveillance completing the deposit. They would also open an Apple Credit Union account in RD's name on August 26, 2019, and apply for a $10K loan that would be deposited into the account shortly after on August 28, 2019. So just like that, after one meeting with Caprice, from between August 20th to August 28th, 2019, the Fosters would open two bogus accounts, deposit a bad check for nearly $5,000, and apply for and obtain a $10,000 loan in just about a week. Sheesh. And one of the final chain of victims that were part of the Fosters' identity theft scheme starts with EG, who during the summer of 2019 unfortunately connected with Caprice through his uncle. EG's uncle felt Caprice would be helpful in helping him expand his landscaping business, but as with many of the other victims, EG would eventually find out that Caprice was no one to play with. Caprice would end up connecting EG with a loan officer by the name of Mark Cox to assist him in obtaining a business line of credit. Marcus. Anyway, Cox would request copies of EJ's social security card, driver's license, and obtain other personal information on EG as part of the so-called line of credit application. But shortly after giving the information, EG would start receiving phone calls from different banks about unusual activity or new accounts opened in his name that he knew nothing about. EG would ask Cox if he opened these accounts, and Cox would admit he did, but insisted it was for EG's own benefit. Right. EG felt all this was suspicious, so he would end up cutting ties with Cox and dead all contact he had with him. About a month later, on September 26, 2019, the Fosters would use EG's info to open an account with Alliant Credit Union and deposit a stolen credit card convenience check in the amount of $6,300 into the account on October 11, 2019. The bank would place a hold on the check for suspicious activity, and a man claiming to be EG would call up multiple times looking to get the hold removed, giving a different explanation about the check each time. The bank would eventually confirm the check was indeed no good and the account would be closed due to fraud, but of course, that wasn't the end of the mayhem that the Fosters wreaked on EG's identity. On December 2019, like they did to many other victims, they would use EG's identity to obtain a lease for a residential property on Harathy Drive in Dunloring, Virginia, from an individual named JT. They would live in this property until July 2020, of course, without paying no rent. Now, while living in this same property, they would end up obtaining the property owner's, JT, personal information. And after not paying the man rent for months, they would have the audacity to use his identity to begin looking into another property to jump into. Imagine that. You use a stolen identity to get into an apartment, you don't pay rent, then you steal the identity of your new landlord to get into another lease. That's just flat out insane, y'all. Anyway, on May 16, 2020, the Fosters would end up using JT's identity on a rental application for a property on Calla Drive in McLean, Virginia. And about a week later, on May 25, 2020, they would write a check against an account they fraudulently opened in JT's name for $10,000 as a deposit on the apartment rental that, of course, did not clear. They would create all sorts of stories as to why the check didn't clear in order to string along the property management company until they eventually handed it another check written against the name of an individual listed as DDT that the Fosters falsely claimed was JT's sister. And finally, with this victim, DDT, the paperwork indicates that the Fosters got their hands on her information around February 2020 while still living in the residence owned by JT on Harathy Drive. And from between February to March 2020, they would use her information to open a bank account and a credit card with JP Morgan Chase that they would charge up over $19,000 in unpaid expenses on. They would also apply for and get approved for a $63,000 loan for a 2018 Range Rover. And once they got the car, they would park it in the garage of the property they were staying at under the identity of EG on Harathy Drive, although the vehicle's registration was associated with DDT's identity. So clearly, throughout the Fosters' entire scheme, they were very sloppy, brazen, and reckless in the way that they stole and commingled the identities and jumped from lease to lease as they dodged rent payments and racked up past due rent charges on these victims' identities in the process. So it's only right we transition over to how their scheme fell apart and the things they did that ultimately tied the scheme right back to them. First, this isn't called out specifically in the paperwork I reviewed, but I would have to assume that Caprice's employer, Hilton Grand Vacations, must have started getting some complaints from Caprice's clients. Because I mean, think about it. The Fosters employed the same method over and over in stealing the identities of many of Caprice's clients, and in many occasions called out in the paperwork, the clients would have fraud on their accounts shortly after meeting with her. So I'd have to gamble in saying that created a pattern that raised some red flags. I'm just saying. Next, as called out in the paperwork, on several occasions, Marcus was caught on surveillance depositing bad checks, so it seems like the Fosters didn't put much effort into hiding their traces and doing things like adding Caprice's daughter on several of the fraud accounts they opened and the leases they applied for only created additional connections back to the Fosters. Also, considering how much fraud they did online, I'm shocked IP address information wasn't used to track the activity right back to them. And finally, on many of the fraud accounts they opened, they would transfer money to and from accounts opened in their real identities, which I can only imagine made the investigating of the fraud they conducted even easier. But with all that being said, on October 22, 2019, the Fairfax County Police Department will respond to a report of an unlawful entry at a residence that was listed as for sale and vacant. When law enforcement arrived to the scene, the Fosters would falsely represent themselves as identity theft victims EG and NN, until law enforcement ran their fingerprints and uncovered their true identities. The Fosters would be charged with trespassing and false identification to law enforcement and would end up being arrested. Now, upon their arrests, they would be found in possession of various financial records, copies of identifications, loan applications, and checks that were not in their names. Marcus would later be interviewed by detectives, and your boy would proceed to admit that he and his wife used someone else's identity to qualify for the residence they were caught in, and that on 2 different occasions he found unattended USPS mail bins that were just filled with mail that he and his wife stole and used to qualify for the housing they was in, since they were not in a fixed residence. From this and more, law enforcement would start to unravel the Foster scheme and begin interviewing the various victims whose identities were stolen. They would also go through the phone records of the Fosters and locate tons of text messages in which Caprice and Marcus communicated with each other about the scheme. And from these messages, law enforcement would determine that Caprice was the mastermind of the operation due to the way she called the shots for the scheme, stole information, and directed Marcus on what to do. Caprice Foster and Marcus Foster would both eventually be found guilty and be sentenced to prison for bank fraud and are serving 80 and 58 months in prison, respectively. So when it comes to these type of identity theft schemes, there's a couple of tips I could share to make sure that you do not get caught slipping like these poor victims. First, it's really important that you keep track of your credit. I can imagine these people that were having past due rent being reported to credit agencies had to have these things pop up on their credit reports. And if you have things set up like credit alerts from any of the million of apps that are out there, it's real easy for you to be able to stay on top of anything funny going on with your credit that you're not aware of. Next, if you're one of those people who have tons of credit cards that you just collect like Pokemon trading cards, it's probably a good idea to get some of those cards closed or find a way to keep tabs on them. By having these credit cards open with large credit limits on them, you will be receiving tons of promotional information from your bank, which will usually include these convenience checks that, if they end up in the hands of people like the Fosters, can easily be used to do fraud on your credit card. If you insist on keeping these credit lines open for whatever reason, it's probably a good idea to get alerts set up so when anytime transactions are done on these cards, you will be notified immediately and you could check to see if it's something that you actually authorize. And last, do not be overly trusting of anybody. And I mean anybody. That also includes professionals, real estate professionals, people who work at the bank. It doesn't matter. You cannot be overly trusting to anyone. You should always question what is being done with your information and ask if certain copies are necessary if you handed in the information on an application. Granted, many of these transactions do need copies of your IDs and etc., but even more reason why you should be keeping track of your identification, because even if you're dealing with a professional, as we could see with Miss Caprice Foster, they cannot always be trusted. So with that being said, that's the end of the video. I hope you were entertained or you found some value from it. If you did, as always, make sure you hit that like button and also subscribe to the channel, y'all. I got big dreams of hitting 50,000 subscribers next year, and I need your help for that. All right? So make sure you subscribe to the channel if you want to add some quality, informative, and entertaining content to your YouTube timeline and stay one step ahead of these fraudsters. All right? Peace.